Thank you, Amber. Hello, my name is Rhonda, and I'm a recovered Al-Anon. This is really exciting for me to be here at this podium. I want to thank the committee for inviting me, Mike, and for all the work that you guys have done. And Amber, what a great hostess. I contacted her just a couple days ago, and I says, we had some special needs. We need some groceries in our room. Is it possible for you to get them to us before we get there Thursday night? And she did. She went into our room. She stocked our fridge for us. And, and then I called a clerk here, and I asked them, if we could get a blender for our room, too. And she called me back, and she says, we talked to the bar, and we can't get a blender. She says, but I'm not going to use mine this weekend, so I'm going to bring you my blender. And the desk clerk gave us her blender for the weekend. So, kudos to the Marriott, too, And I want to thank my husband for putting up with me in my unrecovered Al-Anonism, and for coming out here and being supportive of me. And it's been a treat to have him with me. This is a really special experience for 1,000,001 reasons. So thank you for that, baby. And I also want to say that everything I say here from the podium today about, obviously my husband is part of my story, and my mom and my grandfather and my stepson and, whoever else I talk about, I'm talking from my perspective of what happened. This is a disease of perception, and, I don't know really what it was or how I interpreted it. But I'm going to share my experience with what I went through. So I just wanted to qualify that. I also I'm a fan of history, of AA and Al-Anon history. And I think it's really important for us to know where we came from and to know what we contributed to both of our fellowships. And, how we went through it together. And if it weren't for the Al-Anons, the AAs wouldn't be here. And if it weren't for the AAs, the Al-Anons wouldn't be here. We did this together. We did it at the same time together. And I have two Al-Anon heroes. The first one is Dr. Bob's wife, Ann Smith. And the second one is Arbutus O'Neill, who shared this podium. And so that makes it really exciting for me. But I have a letter here written by Henrietta Dotson to Bill Wilson. And Henrietta Dotson was AA number 3's wife, the man in the bed. And Henrietta's contribution to our fellowships was that after she learned the program from Ann in Akron, she went back to Cleveland with her husband, and she worked in an institution, and there was an alcoholic nurse there, and she taught the AA program to the alcoholic nurse, and she and the alcoholic nurse brought the first AA program ever into an institution. And that's a contribution of the Al-Anons. So I'd like to read this letter that Henrietta wrote about Ann Smith. And then I have something else just something quick that Bill wrote about Ann in the grapevine after she died. Let me grab some water here. Okay. Henrietta writes, on Friday, June 28th, 1935, I met Ann Smith. I met the most thoughtful, understanding person I'd ever known. After talking with her a while, I addressed her as Mrs. Smith. She said, "It's Ann to you, dear." She wanted to take down all the barriers. Skipping down the letter a little bit, Ann told me to surrender myself to God and ask Him if He had a plan for me, to reveal it to me. Ann taught me to have a quiet time in the morning, that I might feel closer to God and receive strength for the day. Sounds like our step 11. She taught me to surrender my husband to God, not to try to tell him how to stay sober, as I had tried that and failed. Ann taught me to love everyone. She said, ask yourself, what is wrong with me today if I don't love you? She said the love of God is triangular. It must blow from God, through me, through you, and back to God. She taught me that I should never criticize the remarks of a person leaving the meeting, as we don't know God's plan, maybe what that person said will meet the needs of someone in the group. In the early part of 1936, Anne organized a women's group for wives of alcoholics, whereby in her loving way she tried to teach us patience, love, and unselfishness. That sounds like Al-Anon. Anne made it very plain to me in the beginning that she wanted no credit for herself. It was God. All she wanted was to keep herself so that she could know and follow God's plan. When I met and talked with this intelligent and deeply spiritual woman, I was completely sold on AA. And then Bill wrote in the grapevine, this is from July 1949. He said, Ann Smith has taken leave from us. She died on Wednesday, June 1st. To hundreds who really knew her, this was a meaningful and moving event. With those who knew her not, I wish to share the inspiration which she gave to Lois and me. Ann was the wife of Dr. Bob, co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. She was quite literally the mother of our first group, Akron number 1. Her wise and beautiful counsel to all, her insistence that the spiritual come before anything else, her unwavering support of Dr. Bob in all his works, all these were virtues which watered the uncertain seed that was to become AA. Who but God could assess such a contribution? We can only say that it was priceless and magnificent. In the full sense of the word, she was one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. Okay. And I also, had Amber read from this old Al-Anon literature. I'm a buff, like I said, I'm a history buff. And this is Al-Anon approved literature, and it's the 2 chapters from the big book, To Wives and Their Family Afterwards. And in this book, it says that we hope these 2 chapters will tempt the reader to peruse the entire AA book, for it is most desirable for the maid of an alcoholic to have as much understanding of the problem as possible. And then it goes on to say it was about 1945 that the groups of families of alcoholics met regularly with carefully planned programs for their own development. Then in 1951, a clearinghouse or central service office was opened, thereby establishing a place where ideas could be exchanged and information given those desperately seeking help. That paragraph is important to me because Lois Wilson was on my resentment list. Right? I'm doing my inventory, and the person that's here, my inventory says, "Really? Lois Wilson?" I said, "Yeah, because I'm reading that Ann Smith was doing like Al-Anon meetings in the 30s, and this is saying that, in the 40s, and who was she to take ownership and be a co-founder, and then one day I heard a CD of Lois talking, and Lois herself on the CD said, I wasn't a co-founder of Al-Anon. She said, I put Al-Anon together and I organized it and I cataloged it so that everybody could find each other. She said, but Al-Anon was in the works long before it ever got organized in 1951. So, we've been on the map a long time, a lot longer than 1951. And, there's something else I want to do, too. Our lineage, I'm a primary purpose group, Al-Anon. And our lineage, we're big on the set-aside prayer. And it's not my intention to upset anyone with anything that I say today. And I think that the best way to really address that is to do a set-aside prayer. So if you guys don't mind, I'd like to say a set-aside prayer. Dear God, please help us set aside everything we think we know about alcoholism, Al-Anonism, our fellowships, the steps, and especially you, God. We ask that we have a truly open mind so we might have a new experience with these things. Please help us see the truth. Amen. I'm going to start my story kind of in the middle, and I jump around a lot, but you'll follow me. It's what we do, right? So, let's see. I met my husband when he was 14 years sober. And, I didn't know a whole lot about AA at the time, other than he had to be honest, because he's in AA. And he doesn't drink, right? So I figure I got it made, you know. So you know, and I am this crazy Al-Anon, and I just think that he is the hottest thing in the world. I still do, but I was just crazy, and there was just this attraction to him, and I was, I was obsessed with him, and I'm sure he didn't know that. Maybe he did, I don't know, but it was something for me, and then we went up to the Wilson house. We dated for about a year and a half, and we went up to the Wilson house, which is in East Dorset, Vermont, and that's where Bill Wilson was born, behind the bar. And that's a little inn, and they do AA meetings there and stuff like that. And he took me to my first AA meeting that night, and he proposed to me in the living room where Bill Wilson was born. And, and he said to me, I wanted to take you here. This is a very important part of my life, and I want you to be a part of it now. And that was my first experience with AA. And so we got married that June. We got married about 6 months later. And on our 1 month wedding anniversary, my stepson was an alcoholic, and he was involved with drugs, and he contacted us wanting to come up to Connecticut and get sober. He lived in Florida. And, I strapped on my Al-Anon cape, which I didn't even know I had at the time. It was really my, my self-centeredness, my self-seeking, right? And I'm like, oh, yes, bring him up here. I will get him sober because no one else has, and I'm thinking, he didn't want to come up before we got married. And he lived with his mom, and I can do this. So, on our 1 month anniversary, I went to the airport, and I picked him up, and, and we were both in it, in it to win it. We were going to get this kid sober, but, I knew that I would be a really big part of it. So, he's going to say that, too, when he hears the CD. But, for months, it went okay. He was all in, and I would sit on a bed with him at night when he would cry, and my husband would be like, "Leave him alone." I'm like, "No, he needs me." So I would, go and console him, and our marriage, we had just gotten married, don't forget, and our marriage really was focused on him, and all the attention went to him from both of us, not just my husband, but both of us. And so we they did a lot of meetings together and stuff like that, and I started to feel left out. And I felt like I was on the outside looking in. And remember, I didn't have a program, and I didn't understand the program. So to me, my interpretation was that I was on the back burner, and this kid took my place, and he's now more important than me. And, I really resented that, And about a year into the marriage and into everything, I was at a breaking point, and I went to Al-Anon for the first time. And, my first experience walking into Al-Anon was that I had never, because like I said before, I never had women friends or anybody. So I walked into an Al-Anon room, and all these women just embraced me, and they loved me, and they consoled me. I told my story, and I got my box of tissues, and and I cried, and they supported me, and and that was a wonderful feeling. I really felt welcomed. I looked for a sponsor, and and this is one of the things that I really had issues with, was that, and I think maybe both fellowships may have these issues, is that, there's the sponsorship for me in the rooms that I went into was not there. I asked 4 people to sponsor me, and everybody said no. And finally, I found a woman to sponsor me, and she was telling me things that I needed to tell my husband, and set these boundaries, and he can do this, and he can't do this, and this is right, and this is wrong. And I'm saying, I'm a sick Al-Anon, and that doesn't make sense to me, and I can't say that to my husband. It just doesn't feel right. So I didn't. And one night she says to me, I'm going to this meeting, and it's really important for you to go too, and it's a women's group, and I really want you to go. And so I'm like, I'm hurting. I'm going. Whatever you tell me to do, I'll do, except talk to my husband like that. And so as the time came for the meeting, I said, so this is an Al-Anon meeting, and it's all women? And she says, well, no, it's really not. She said, it's, we're doing this pyramid thing, and if you bring friends, then, I'll make money, and, And I thought, wow, that's my first experience with an Al-Anon sponsor, and it was sad, and I'm not saying that Al-Anon's like that, because it's not, but this is my experience, and I can only share my experience. And so I continued as best I could. I read the steps off the wall, and I would look at them and, read step 1, yeah, I'm there, I'm powerless, And then I'd read step 2, and, God would restore me to sanity. I'm like, when was I sane? And I had to go back a lot of years to figure that out. And I would go through the steps, and I'd be like, yeah, I'm doing that, yeah, I'm doing that, yeah, And I had no idea that there was a specific way to do the steps. I had no idea. And I was reading, the Al-Anon literature and stuff, and I still had no idea. And I met a woman, and I loved her. I loved the way that she shared. She seemed so healthy. And I met her, and I asked her to sponsor me. And she said, I'll sponsor you. She said, but I can only sponsor you the way that I was sponsored. And I said, okay, what do we do? And so she said, I only sponsor out of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. She said, and if you're not comfortable with that, you need to find somebody else. And at that time, I said, I'm desperate. I don't care. I'll do anything. And 2 months ago, had you said that to me, the Big Book of Alcoholics represented me not being with my husband. It represented my husband just going off and leaving me, and I wanted nothing to do with opening a book that was going to tell me more about that. But I need to backtrack a little bit, because I was asked to speak at the AA convention in Connecticut, and I'm doing my story, and I'm writing down about how abandoned I felt, and how deserted, and how he was putting his son before me, and all this stuff, and then it hit me like, but I felt like this before him, like I was like this in my past relationships. And then I looked at it and I said, whoa, I've been like this in all my relationships. What is up with that? It's not about him. And it gets confusing when you're around an alcoholic and you don't have a program, because you and everybody else thinks, well, she's with an alcoholic, and so she's a saint for being with him, and he's a high risk. And it's, and it's not like that. It's like, I'm crazier than him, So I look back at my past, and I'm trying to figure all this out, and I'm looking through my childhood, and I'm thinking, my mother was like this too, And then I looked at the way she was raised, and it's just like Deb's story, My mother was raised by an active alcoholic, my grandfather. And that's where my Al-Anonism came from. This is a generational thing, and even if we're not exposed to the drinking, we're still getting sick because we learn the alcoholic behavior. And, children learn what they live, and it trickles down, and the book says the alcoholic life is the only normal one. So for me and for my mother, the alcoholic mind is normal. That's what we have. We have an alcoholic mind. I don't have an allergy to alcohol. I have an alcoholic mind, and I have a spiritual sickness. And I need to heal the way that you guys healed. So in looking at that, alcoholism has saved my life twice. And the first time it saved my life was long before I was ever born. It was July of 1944. And my alcoholic grandfather, he was a Jekyll and Hyde, and he was really scary to my mother. Not so much with us kids. We saw a totally different side of him. He would take us in the kitchen, and he'd reach in the cupboard and go, want to see Poppy take his medicine? And he'd reach in the cupboard, and he'd grab his bottle, and he'd grab the silver measuring spoons, and he'd pour it into the tablespoon, and he'd take it, and he'd go, isn't that funny? And we'd all laugh, and do it again, Poppy, do it again, And he's out there doing shots out of his tablespoon, and my grandmother's yelling, Frank, cut it out, But in July of 1944, my grandfather bought tickets. My mom was 5, and my grandfather bought tickets to the Barnum and Bailey Circus. And all the neighborhood kids were excited, and the day of the circus came, and my grandfather was too drunk to take them. And my grandmother was so much like Ann Smith. I don't think she ever worked an Al-Anon program. But she seemed so much like Ann. She was very spiritual, very religious, God kept her safe and protected from his alcoholism. I never saw any signs of Al-Anonism in her. And so the day of the circus, my grandfather was too drunk, and he was out, and he couldn't take him. And my grandmother let him be responsible for it himself and didn't take the kids. And all the kids had to stay home. And later on that day, they learned that the circus caught on fire 20 minutes into the show. And within 8 minutes, the big top burned to the ground. And 170 children died that day in Hartford, Connecticut. And my mom could have easily been one of those, And had my grandmother stepped in, she could have been one of those too. So that was the first time that alcoholism saved my life. And, growing up, I was the youngest of 3. Deb used to lock the kids out, and I would have been the kid locked out. But they didn't lock me out; they flushed me down the toilet. The minute the back door, I would talk to my mother, and I'd be like, "No, Mommy, please don't go. They're going to hurt me. They're going to flush me." And my mother's like, "No, they're not. They're good kids." And back door would slam, and the two of them would just grab me, my brother and sister, and they'd drag me to the toilet, and one would flush and one would stuff. And I would tell my mother, and she never believed me. She always believed them, and I would get punished for lying. And my father left when I was 5, and I had this horrible, fear of abandonment. I was the youngest of 3. They told me I was an accident. My sister was the first, and she was wonderful. And my brother was the only boy, and he was wonderful. And then I was an accident, and I learned that. And again, we got to be careful with the stuff we tell our kids, even when we're joking, because they're sponges, and they get that. And I grew up like that, And I grew up not feeling as loved as them. And I had to fight for that, And my brother and sister, my brother lied about me the whole time my mother was alive. And after my mom died 16 years ago, and my brother came to me after she died, and he said, "I'm sorry for always lying to you, lying to Mom about you." He said, "But I always had to be right in her eyes, and I couldn't ever let you be." So I lived behind that, And growing up, like I said before, I started drinking when I was 11 years old. My mother allowed it. She allowed us to drink alcohol at 11. And then she allowed us to watch pornography. And that really changes who you are. It changes, the map. And that's why, I laughed afterwards because, the now about sex thing, it's like, that's the biggest part of my story. Is this whole chaotic sexual thing, So that's how I grew up. And she, like I said before too, she was able to address her bedevilments with men. That's how she would get out of it, And we had a revolving door, and it didn't matter if they were married or not, as long as it was someone paying attention. And when one would leave, the next would move in. And I remember one time, one guy, he was, and they were always alcoholics. And one guy, they broke up, and he was going back to his wife, but he didn't want to lose her either. And so he's sitting in his van in front of my house with a shotgun in his lap. And me and my brother and sister, I don't know how old we were, but I remember standing at the front door, the 3 of us begging her not to go to the van. And she was just so obsessed, and she had that need, and that need was so much more important than anything else that was going on around her. And she walked to the van, and I'm thinking, I could watch my mother die right now, And thank God, it all worked out, but, kind of scary stuff to grow up with, And so when I, got into my dating age and stuff, I was living with the bedevilments too, and I get into my dating stage, and the first guy I dated made those bedevilments go away. You know, kind of like a lot of you guys when you tell your story and you take that first drink and, you know, that's what I experienced. And that put me off to the races, you know. That was the only way that I could get out of myself. And up until that point, I had always spent a lot of time alone. My brother and sister and my mother would always say, "Why are you always alone? Why are you always alone?" I'd shut myself in my room. And but then once I started getting involved with boys, totally different. I was never alone. I couldn't be alone. I couldn't handle being alone for 5 minutes. You know, and that went on for years. It went on all through my 20s and 30s and, you know, into my 40s. I can be alone now. It's okay. But you know, and with that, not only was it the bedevilments, it was also this fear of abandonment would turn to rage. I didn't know what to do with that fear, and it turned to rage, and I was violent. You know, I remember I was engaged to a guy, and I remember something happened. I don't even remember what it was, but I remember grabbing this huge coffee table, and I just threw it across the whole living room, you know, and it bounced off the wall. And 8 days before we were supposed to get married, he called my sister, and he said, "I'm not doing this." He said, "I can't live with that kind of rage. I have 2 kids, and I'm not putting my kids in that situation. I'm done." And I never, to this day, I've never seen him again. He left all his clothes in the dressers. He left all his money in the bank account. He left everything and just left because that's how bad my rage was. You know? And then I got married about a year later. I got married to someone that I didn't love because I didn't want to be abandoned. And I figured, well, if I didn't love him, who cares if he leaves, right? So then I started, you know, having an affair with a married man while I'm with him. And, you know, I'm getting married, and the married man's going like, "Why are we together and you're getting married?" You know, I'm like, "Oh, it's fine, it's fine. You got a wife, I'll have a husband, it's fine," you know. And I invited him and his wife to my wedding, and they came. And I went over to the photographer I know, right? I went over to the photographer in my big white wedding dress, and I said, "Make sure you get a good picture of me and him dancing together." Right? And he did. And the marriage lasted about 2 months. I don't know why. I tried. But shortly after, you know, there were some signs, and I missed them, you know. You know, he bought me a brand new red Trans Am GTA right off the showroom floor, paid for it in cash, and I didn't really believe he was dealing drugs. He could have been, you know. So, so by the time, my husband's hearing this for the first time. So by the time the wedding album came, he was gone. But, you know, I come home. But I had some great pictures, right? So one day I come home from work, and I'm figuring out, because the people that I work with are like, "Hey, is your husband home? Because I got to make a stop at your apartment." You know, so I'm thinking, uh-oh, this ain't good. So I'm hearing that, like, there's like $100,000 worth of coke going through my apartment at a time. And I'm like, not good, you know, but I am going to put a stop to this. So I go home, and because I'm married now, right? So I go home, and I'm like, I'm under the impression that you are dealing drugs, and you have a choice to make, because I am not going to live with a drug dealer, so you can either stop or you can leave. Now, remember, I'm not in love with him anyway. I got my boyfriend, right? So he never says a word to me. He gets up off the couch, and he goes to the refrigerator. He opens the door, and he grabs his suitcase of Budweiser, and he sticks it under his arm, and he walks out the door, and that was the end of him. Right? You guys should see my husband's face right now. I told you I love him, and he's the best guy in the world. So anyway, moving right along. So I'm going to fast forward back to my my marriage. I was just crazy. And like I had said before, my husband kind of had me lined up with a backup in case anything happened to him. Now, I was totally crazy, madly in love with my husband, so I had no involvement with this other person, but every time we would have an argument or something would happen, I could call him, and we would hang out, and it would be okay, because I had him if I was upset with him, And there came a time where he died. He was an unrecovered Al-Anon, and he put a gun to his head. And his brother hung himself, and his sister OD'd, and his mom never recovered. And you go by her house today, and she has 3 candles in the window lit for each one of her children that died of her alcoholism. And so now I don't have a backup. It's just me and my husband. And then my dog died. 15 years, my lab died. And my husband comes home one night, and, it was maddening. I was maddening. And he comes home one night, and he says, I'm leaving. He says, I need to separate from you for 90 days. And I'm like, there's no way. I can't do that, And I totally lost it, and I turned to rage. And I think that was the first time that my husband really saw my rage to that degree, because I tried to hide it as best I could. And I just grabbed a stool in the kitchen, and I just smashed it into a million pieces on the floor. And the look on his face was like, wow. He had just never seen that in me before, to that degree. And he left. And I was waiting tables at the time at night, and I was, working my day job. And I would go to work, and I would look for the person that had drank the most all day. Because like Debbie, I didn't really want to live, but I really didn't have it in me to do it. But if I got in the car with someone that was drunk, and it happened, no one would even know that it was really what I intended for it to have happen. And I wouldn't have been blamed for it. I would have been the victim of it. And, fast forwarding to Sue, the woman who put the big book in my hand. And she said, we'll do it. This is the way I can do it. Can't do it any other way. So I did it, and we got to the 4th step. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Hyannis group. Yeah. It takes the Hyannis group about 1.5 to 2 years to write a 4th step, and about another year to hear the 5th step. And I said to her, I'm going to be dead long before that. I don't have 2 or 3 years to do a 4th and a 5th step. I just don't, So she said, and to me, this was an awesome sponsor. She said to me, I don't know how to do it any other way, because that's the way that I learned. She said, but if you would like, my husband was sponsored by a gentleman down in Dallas, Texas, and I can give you his name and phone number, and you can call him and explain the situation, and maybe he can put you in touch with an Al-Anon Big Book that can bring you through the work quicker than I can. And I thought, how awesome is that? There was no ego. There was nothing. She was my stepping stone to bring me to my freedom. And so I called Cliff, and, I ran it by him, and I explained it to him. And, and he says to me, well, darling, now Cliff is 89 years old from Dallas. And at the time, he's older now. He's still kicking. He's older now. And, I explained it to him, and he says, well, darling, if you came to me all the way from John Pepper in Hartford, Connecticut, then I think that I'm the one that God wants to sponsor. So I said, okay. So he says, we'll do it through Skype. And I says, I don't know how to Skype. I don't even have Skype on my computer. He says, I'll tell you. So my 89-year-old sponsor walked me through downloading Skype onto my computer. and we did all of my work through Skyping. And, he taught me, he took me through the work, just like you guys did the work, with AA and the Big Book. That's how I did my work. And I'm not saying it's for everyone. And I'm not saying this to offend anybody, but it's my experience. I wasn't getting well in the rooms of Al-Anon without that book. Maybe I'm sicker. Maybe I'm a sicker Al-Anon. They say the hopeless variety. Maybe I'm a hopeless variety Al-Anon. And that was the only thing that was going to get me better. So I did the work, and it's funny because you know that 12th step, you got to sponsor people, and I'm like, there are so many sponsors in the rooms. I don't really need to do that. I just need to recover myself. And I wasn't really getting it, you know. And so I had no intention of sponsoring. And my husband, right after we went through this work, now we've gone through the work, and I've gone through my work, and he went through his work first. And he came back to make amends to me. And he was awesome, and he made amends for everything that had happened over the course of our marriage. And, you know, and I'm like, oh, I love you, and I want to be with you, and let's get back together. And he said, no. He said, you need to do your work first, because you don't know who you're going to be on the other side of your work. And you might not want me anymore, you know? And I'm like, oh, you know, but when he left, I was almost addicted to him. You know, I mean, when he left, I went through withdrawals. I would shake and vomit, and I couldn't eat, and I couldn't sleep, and I couldn't do anything, you know. And at that point, I really had to find out whether I was addicted to him or whether I was really in love with him. And he knew that. And he knew that when he came back and he made those amends to me, that I needed to do my work to see where I was at and who I was and what my sound and sane ideal was going to be. And so I did. I finished my work, and I made my amends to him. And, you know, God had a plan to put us back together, you know. And with God in our marriage, in our relationship, it works a whole lot better, you know. And I guess that's what Amber sees in us, because now we do have God in our relationship. But I wasn't going to sponsor. So he took me to the Wilson house. He took me to the Wilson house and for our first workshop together. It was Charlie and Katie. Yeah. So Katie, it's the first time I'm meeting Katie, right? And if you don't know Charlie and Katie, oh my God. Katie is a handful, and then some. So she, you know, she's hugging me for the first time. She's like, oh, it's so nice to finally meet you. And then she pulls me away, and she goes, oh my God, you're an Al-Anon. I said, yes, I am. She says, we just got a phone call from someone in Oklahoma. And you are the only Al-Anon at this workshop, and you need to make a phone call. And I said, oh, no. I'm not doing that yet. I'm not going to do that. You know, I'm just starting my amends. You know. And she goes, oh, no. You're going to take this phone number, and you're going to go sit in your car, and you're going to call this woman now. And you really don't say no to Katie. You know? So I did. And I called this woman, and I had no idea what I was doing. But, you know, God picks up the slack. You know, if you just make that connection and you are willing to do God's work, God will work through you. You know, and I made that phone call. And the situation was something that I had done personally. And probably a lot of other people hadn't done. And I was able to help that woman as probably a lot of other people wouldn't have been able to, because I had first-hand experience. And to me, that was God telling me that I am supposed to sponsor people. And, you know, Katie Parker is truly responsible for me sponsoring people. And I jumped in with both feet. And I am so grateful to her for that, because that was the turning point of my program. You know, that's when I entered into and I maintained the freedom that I maintained in the program. I sponsor people, you know, anywhere, because Katie goes everywhere, and, you know, I'm like the big book Al-Anon that Katie knows, and so she gives everybody my phone number. So I sponsor people all over the country, and we Skype people, and we do a meeting at my house on Monday nights, and we study, just like like I said, we're primary purpose, so we study the book one paragraph at a time. And we Skype people in from all different parts of the country, and it's alcoholics and Al-Anons, and we all study the book together. And, you know, it's amazing that I have put the book into many alcoholic women's hands that never opened it before. And, you know, and they thanked me for that. It's like, had you not come into our meeting, and had you not talked about this book, I never would have known, had the understanding of our program that I now have today. You know, I had this one woman who, she says to me, you know, when you first started coming to our meeting, it really bothered me that you talked about the big book. And she says, and she was an alcoholic. And she says, it really bothered me. And I didn't think you had any right. And, we re-dropped the rock, and you shouldn't be talking about the big book. And I'm like, and she says, but then I talked to my sponsor. And my sponsor said, listen to what she's saying. Listen to the message that she's carrying from that book. That's our book that she's carrying to you. And I had that conversation in my living room because she now attends the meeting that I hold at my house on Monday nights. So that's kind of cool. I've had the opportunity to bring the big book into women's sober houses, to women that have never been through the book before. I don't bring them through the book. I don't sponsor alcoholics, but I can carry the message that's in the book and show how the program is laid out and encourage them to find a sponsor that works out of the book like that. I want to share with you a couple of experiences that we've had. My husband and I, we're new at this intimacy thing. Like, we haven't had it down from day one, because I didn't recover until 5 years into our marriage. So, we're a little bit behind on this. And but we're learning, and sometimes we still have difficulties. And last year we had plans to go to the international convention down in Atlanta, and we were taking our motorcycles down. And I was really excited because it was like my first really long road trip on my bike. And things happened between us, and my husband decided that he wasn't going to go. And part of my program is that I have to maintain myself and my program and my life with or without my husband, just like Amber was saying. We're parallel, but we're not. And so I said to him, I'm going to go anyway. It's the right thing for me to do with my program. And the day before, and we had some friends. We have a couple that we both sponsored, and they were going down too. And so they were going down ahead of us. So I lined it up with her husband, Pete, so that if anything happened while I was on the road, if I was beyond a certain point south, he would come and get me and help me. And I had a guy up here, a girlfriend's husband up here, that if anything happened north of that line, that he would come and get me. So I was pretty okay, and I have a license to carry my firearms, so I can carry it down to Atlanta. And so I was going to be okay. A girl on a motorcycle, I think that guys don't really realize sometimes how scary and vulnerable it is. I pull up to a stoplight, and I got nowhere to hide. I can't lock the doors. I can't get away. I'm just a sitting duck, So I do carry a firearms when I'm on my motorcycle and I'm alone like that. But the day before we left for Atlanta, I was bringing a sponsee with me because Dane wasn't going to go. And the day before we were leaving, Dane came and said to me, he says, I changed my mind. He said, I'd really like to go. Do you mind if I go too? And I said, you can go, but I've already invited someone, and I'm not going to uninvite her. I said, so the three of us can go down together. And so the three of us went down. We went down to Tennessee, and we met up with Glenn and Jane, some friends of ours. And then we jumped in their car, and we went down the rest of the way to Atlanta. And we met up with Pete and Lori, but Lori had gotten sick. Lori was my sponsee, and she had gotten sick when we were down there, right before we got down there. And, they were like, oh, no big deal. Take this medicine. You'll be fine. So a couple days later, she's like, I'm not feeling better, And they put her, they put her in the hospital. And we're like, what the heck, And she's like, I'm fine. And we would take Pete, to dinner with us, and we'd take him, to some of the stuff that was going on at the convention, and he would spend some time with her in the hospital. But she was really pushing him, like, go. It's silly for you not to go. So, Sunday morning came of that week, and, I send her a text, how you doing? She's like, I'm not doing very good. I don't feel good, so don't bother coming. And I says, we're coming. And so we went, and we were in her room, and she just wasn't breathing good. And the girl my sponsee that I brought with me was a nurse, and she threw the oxygen clip on her finger. And she saw that her oxygen level was like at 81. It was really low. And so we contacted the nurse, and we said, you got to get here now. She's at 81%. And they came into the room, and they said, you guys got to leave. And so they, made us leave, and they grabbed her, and they threw her in the elevator to bring her down to ICU. And she went into cardiac arrest on the elevator. And we're in the we're in the waiting room for 2 hours, We were just talking to her. My sponsee and I gave her a nice massage with lavender oil and stuff. And, 2 hours later, the doctor comes out and says, she went into cardiac arrest and she was down for 45 minutes. And they says, we work on them for about 20 and we stop. But we didn't want to stop with her, so we just kept going and, we brought her back after 45 minutes of being down with no oxygen. And so we went in to see her, and she was on life support. And, I didn't, she wasn't always my favorite person. When I first started working with her and stuff, she was like little Sally Sunshine, and, and she taught me so much about humility. I was in a meeting one night, and there was something that I needed to say that was pertinent to what we had just read. And I looked at her and I said, I'm not going to share it because her life is so good and she's so happy, and I don't want her to see that I'm still struggling with my program this far along. And God just came into my head and said, make a choice. You can either stay sick in your program, or you can either humble yourself in front of her. And I chose to humble myself in front of her. And after that meeting, she came to me and she asked me to sponsor her. And, a lot of her situation was very similar to mine. And, so we started working together and we became friends, and we started doing things together and traveling together. And so, I know that she was in my life to teach me humility. She taught me that day. And from that day on, she taught me more about humility than any other person I've ever worked with, and all the people I've ever worked with combined. And that night in Atlanta, when the doctor told us that she had gone into cardiac arrest, we knew we had to get her family down there, her kids. And, my husband was there with her husband taking care of him. And Pete just handed me his credit card. And I don't know why. I didn't cry. It was like God lifted me up and said, go to work. And Pete gave me the credit card, and her boys were making their airline reservations, and I was making their hotel reservations to get them down there. And Dane and I stayed with Pete through the night while their kids flew from Connecticut down to Atlanta, Georgia, to be with their mom when she died. And I know that I was put in her life to help her family when she died, and to help her die. How do you go on vacation and come back a widow, It was something, but I tell you, the support from the AA and Al-Anon community down there was amazing. Because that week people knew she was looking for blood, and they wouldn't take our blood, but people would come to us and say, are you the one with the sick friend? We'd like to donate blood if we could. And people were praying in restaurants for her, people that didn't know her. People would walk up to us on the street and just hug us and say, we're praying for her. And where do you get that stuff except here? And I'm not a fan of, I don't care what literature you use. If it's going to save your life, and if you are going to save other people's lives, use it. Because that's what this is about. That's our primary purpose, is to help other people to live. And like the reading said, our dark past is what's going to help those newcomers to live. Anything it takes. That's what we've got to do. And then I'm going to tell another story today. My husband had a brother who was developmentally challenged. And sorry. My husband had a brother who was developmentally challenged. And he lived in a group home. And we got a phone call on September 18th. And we're not really sure what happened, whether he fell down the stairs or whether he was pushed down the stairs. But he broke his neck. And he became quadriplegic paralyzed. And, the big book says that we can handle major problems much easier than we can the minute problems. and that put us both into gear. Now, we had just buried Lori in July, and it's September, and we have Will completely paralyzed. He couldn't scratch his head or wipe his nose or itch his eye. He couldn't do anything, and Dane and I took shifts. He did the day shift, and I did the night shift, and we spent every day with him. He had the mentality maybe of a 10-year-old, and you wouldn't leave your 10-year-old child in the hospital, and we weren't going to leave him there either by himself. So we pulled together, and we worked for Will, and we took care of Will, and it was a wonderful experience for me to spend time with him. On a different level, he would ride with me on my trike. He was very, very high functioning. He would ride with me on my trike. He would, I took him snowmobiling for his birthday one year. We just did some fun stuff together, and he was a really busy, active guy. And, we took care of him, and we were driving like 90 miles a day round trip, the two of us, each of us separately, to take care of him, and we had to move him to different facilities and this and that, and long story short, he would always ask, I'd go there and he'd be like, and I had just had shoulder surgery. So I was, in a sling, and I had to do my physical therapy. So I would bring my pulleys, and I would hook him up to his IV bag, and I'd be doing my pulleys, and he's on this oscillating bed, kind of watching me do the pulleys, And God bless him, and he'd always, how's your physical therapy going? Are you doing your work? And, how are you feeling? Because if you're not feeling good, I don't want you to come. And, how are the roads? You got to be careful getting home. And every nurse, everybody that walked in the room, he was always, how are you? How are you? And he always had something good and happy to say, And we sit there and we say, who is developmentally challenged? He was the most selfless person naturally, and we got to work at it our whole lives to try to achieve what he had, And today was Will's birthday, and when I talked to my husband about this conference after Will got hurt and stuff, I said, look, I'm going to go out alone, and you stay home and be with Will, because we needed to keep things as regular for Will as we could, And he said, no, I want to go out. He'll understand. I said, and he insisted. And on January 3rd, God took him home. And we were there with him, and we got to be with him. And we had a beautiful celebration of his life. All his Special Olympic people were there with him, his athletes, and all his coworkers and his housemates, and we had this beautiful celebration. We set up all these picture boards with everybody, and because he was very active, he loved to fish, he loved to do everything, and so we all had, we just celebrated. It was beautiful. It was just a really beautiful celebration of his life, and Will brought our family back together. We healed a little bit more. And the relationships, we had some broken relationships with our kids, I had broken relationships with my stepkids, and my husband had a broken relationship with my daughter. And all that goes away when you see what's really important in life, And that was truly a gift. And, sometimes God talks really loudly to me, and sometimes he talks subtly. And when we were talking last night at dinner with Amber, and we asked Amber where her husband worked. And her husband worked at Goodwill. And that's where Will worked too. And to me, that's God. That's God telling me that that's where we're supposed to be, And I got the right person to host me, And to me, that was God saying that Will's still here, That was a gift. And, this room is called Elm, and we live on Elm Street, And I love the number 2, and this is the 22nd Roundup, So I'm just thinking that, God is he's talking loudly, and I think Dane and I are exactly where we're supposed to be today. And I thank Mike for that, and Bob Darrell, I guess, told Mike about me, so I appreciate that too. I'm going to close with, like I said, my other Al-Anon hero, Arbutus O'Neill. She closed this way at all of her talks, and I'd like to do the same thing. She said this from this podium, and I want to say the exact same thing that she said in closing. But I'm old, so I need my glasses. Arbutus said, "I remind you that the principles of this program hold a message that the whole world needs to know. And I remind you that you are the only people in the world so uniquely qualified to carry this message. Let me remind you that there are many drunken men and women who will die if you fail to carry this message. There are kids out there afraid for their alcoholic mom or dad to come home tonight who will develop warped personalities if we fail to carry this message. And there are men and women who won't have the courage to live one more day with an alcoholic. And they will break up their homes if we fail to carry this message. And if we fail to carry this message, may God have mercy on these people. And may God have mercy on us. Thank you."